All right, welcome to Critical Wade Theory. And today I'm talking about one of the weirdest, smartest, and most unforgettable shows Nickelodeon ever aired, titled Kablam. And this episode is titled All Purpose Kablam. Now, to be honest, this is one of the shows that I never watched when I was a kid. And I just never got around to it. I watched Ren and Stimpy, The Adventures of Pete and Pete, a whole bunch of other shows like Salute Your Shorts and Are You Afraid of the Dark, to name a few. But this one I just never checked out. And I kind of regret that because I think it's a fun show and I'm sure I would have enjoyed it even more as a youngster. But if you grew up in the late 90s, there's a decent chance this show permanently altered your sense of humor if you did see it as a kid. And if you didn't grow up with it, well, Kablam can be hard to explain because it never really behaved like a normal cartoon. It felt more like flipping through a chaotic comic book at 2 a.m. after eating too much sugar. It's like a very frenetic type of show. It's an anthology cartoon, basically. So the episode I'm focusing on is All Purpose Kablam, which is usually listed as season 1, episode 1 on IMDb, but other sources claim that it's actually episode 5. So I'm not really sure if this was the premiere. I was just watching it first because it's what IMDb said is episode 1. And it aired apparently on November 15th, 1996, and it's about 22 minutes, and it somehow managed to cram together superheroes made from household junk, caveman slapstick, surreal animation experiments, fake educational style films, and a kid who accidentally turns herself into a human ecosystem. And honestly, there has never been another show quite like it. Although, of course, some shows have moments that might be a little bit similar, but I don't think they really capture quite the energy that this show has. The structure of Kablam was part of what made it feel different to people. Instead of one continuous story, every episode worked like an anthology, and you had short cartoons that would rotate in and out. They're all connected by the hosts named Henry and June. Henry and June look like they had escaped from an independent comic book. They argue, they interrupt the show, they sometimes break the fourth wall, and basically act like tiny cable access TV producers trying to hold together the animated chaos. And even though their names carry a weird literary joke, fans have long pointed out the likely reference. It's an incredibly strange thing to sneak into a Nickelodeon cartoon for children. And go ahead and look up Henry and June, and you'll possibly be surprised by what might be the source of those names. But anyway, Kablam in general, half the jokes were for kids, the other half felt aimed at exhausted art students and stuff like that. So it's not necessarily just a kid's show, oddly enough. And this episode opens with June inventing an automatic comic page turner machine. It's basically a ridiculous setup that exists only to solve a problem that nobody actually has. And that kind of fake importance energy ran through the whole show. Everything felt like a parody of television itself. And the first major segment is titled Secondhand Sniz from a comic type uh, show titled Sniz and Fondue. And it's an unusual uh, cartoon. Sniz refuses to learn how to tell time, and that's because in classic cartoon logic, responsibility is boring right up until irresponsibility becomes inconvenient. So you've got this character who doesn't know how to tell time. It's probably relatable to very young children who don't always know how to tell time. Like, I mean, you got to walk before you learn to crawl. Wait, no, you got to crawl before you learn to walk. That's it. And so you don't just start off running a marathon. You got to like start off with baby steps. And I think Sniz, not understanding some basic thing like how to tell time is something some of us kids understood, because at a certain point we struggled with basic concepts like, basic math, the alphabet, and of course how to tell time and other things, maybe tying your shoe you weren't very good at as a kid at first. And even simple stuff like that can stump kids, and it might make this character a little bit more relatable. And I kind of like that in this episode, because I I have vague memories of feeling like I was dumb because I just couldn't grasp certain simple things when I was like a very young kid. You know what I mean? And I think that's a nice part of this episode. And the humor here is pure mid '90s Nickelodeon. You've got these loud personalities, some dumb confidence, and characters creating disasters entirely because they just refuse to do one simple thing. But what's interesting is how fast the pacing feels. Modern animated comedies often pause for reaction shots or self-aware dialogue, and Kablam just barely stopped moving. Jokes were every few seconds. It was hyperactive in a way that almost predicted internet era comedy years before YouTube or TikTok existed. So that's a possible drawback for this show if you're looking for, stories that kind of take it slow and take it easy so you could kind of soak in the story and better even understand what's going on. When things are sort of at a fast or even breakneck speed, it's easy to miss stuff, and you might end up being a little flustered. You might feel kind of stupid, or whatever words you want to use there, because when you've got this rapid fire comedy, it's it's a bit of a mixed bag, and really that's what this show is. And then the episode pivots hard into one of the most beloved segments in the show's history, which you get a lot of people talking about if you go through the reviews of this. A lot of nostalgic memories about this weird superhero thing. So if you remember nothing else from Kablam, you probably remember Action League now, because it's definitely one of the most, appreciated aspects of Kablam. The superheroes were literally made from thrift store toys and random household objects. There was Meltman, whose power was melting. And I gotta admit, that character reminds me of this horror movie called The Incredible Melting Man. And that instantly kind of made me appreciate this story a little bit more. And I also remember when I was a kid and I'd go swimming, I'd run or I'd run my hand, under the water, and I'd pick up mud and I'd pretend my hand was melting, like I was the incredible melting man. And that was a little bit reminder. It was a reminder of that aspect of my childhood. The I don't think that many kids have seen the Incredible Melting Man, but I wonder if this character was inspired by that horror movie at all. It's possible. I don't know. But that's one thing I liked about this episode is that particular character. Then there's also a character called the Stinky Diver, who's apparently a retired scuba guy who smells terrible because he keeps on swimming around in toilets. Now, I don't remember him actually figuring into this episode much, but they do mention him in the beginning of this segment. Then there's the Flesh, who was super strong and super naked. Now, don't worry, they don't have like graphic nudity. It's like Ken doll nudity. But it's a little bit racy for a Nickelodeon cartoon, to have a character who's supposed to be naked. And you've also got a female character whose name I don't actually remember offhand. Um, but it's a cute character. I guess it's a nod to I mean, like she's like a Barbie doll character, to be honest. And I don't remember if she demonstrates superpowers in this episode, but I wouldn't be surprised if I had a you blink and you miss it moment when it comes to that character. But it kind of seems like, I gotta say, like she's mostly eye candy in a way for like the other superheroes or something like that. But anyway, the episode is titled Nightmare on Memory Lane, and in it, Meltman gets hit in the head by a giant phone and loses his memory during a mission. Well, he actually gets hit by a lot of different objects, but the phone is probably the one that clunked him the hardest and gave him the biggest case of amnesia. And the premise feels like somebody generated it by pulling a random word from a hat, like amnesia. Let's just give this character amnesia. And, that was part of the charm, is just the randomness of what happens to these characters. And Action League now looked cheap on purpose. The animation was jerky, the sets are homemade, and all that kind of stuff. It feels kind of improvised, And I'm sure kids loved it because it felt like something you can make in your own basement with toys and maybe a camcorder or something like that. And there's also something fascinating about how the narrator sells everything with total sincerity. Will Meltman ever regain his memory? Will the secret formula in his melted head ever resurface? That kind of stuff. And the show treats absurd nonsense with a seriousness of some action movie cliffhanger. And that contrast is kind of fun, So even now, fans still quote these characters decades later, I'm sure. And then there's another cartoon called Prometheus and Bob. For a lot of fans, this is probably the crown jewel of Kablam. The setup is simple and it's quirky. There's Prometheus, who is an alien, of course, from outer space, and he tries to educate a caveman. You guessed it, his name is Bob. And Bob immediately ruins everything, every single time. The segment in this episode is called Bridge, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Prometheus, who again is a space alien, he tries to teach Bob how to cross a log bridge safely, and Bob responds with the survival instincts of a shopping cart. The genius of Prometheus and Bob was its silence. Most of the humor came from expressions, the sound effects, and the timing of the characters and the quirky situations. And, it's slapstick. They get hurt, these characters. And visually it looked completely different from the rest of the show. Clay animation next to comic book art, next to stop motion toys, next to surreal experimental shorts. That's one of the great things about this series. It's like a grab bag of different elements. And, it makes Kablam feel unpredictable. You genuinely never know what style was coming next. And some fans online still talk about waiting desperately for a new Prometheus and Bob segment to appear during the next episode. And, there's that anticipation. Will it be there or will it not be there? And, that's part of the fun. It's like a gamble. And, there's a lot of love for Prometheus and Bob and some of these other characters. And then Kablam would suddenly throw something at you that barely even qualifies as a cartoon, to be honest. It's like so short and so rapid fire. Like Lava, one of the surreal, surprising shorts segments. There's a strange creature that rides what looks like a rocket or a giant firecracker through bizarre landscapes while chaos unfolds around it. And then, what do you know? There's a surprising portal that, the rocket goes into, and it's something that I'm surprised made it past the censors, to be honest. There's no real explanation, no apparent deep meaning behind it. It's just pure experimental animated energy. And there's another reason the show developed a cult following. Nickelodeon in the 1990s occasionally allowed creators to make things that felt genuinely strange. Not focus group strange, but actually strange. And Kablam often felt like animation festival disguised as children's programming, which is what I really like about this. And there's another segment called Back to Nature, which features a character named Loopy, who decides that she doesn't want to bathe anymore. And it escalates naturally into wildlife moving onto her body and plants growing on her like she's an abandoned national park. And it's a quirky segment. So the lesson here is that, hey, you should bathe. Otherwise, you're going to end up with plants and vegetables growing on your body, I guess. So every tiny decision turns into total absurdity in this show, or this collection of little shows. And in between all these segments, Henry and June keep interrupting with, so whatever they do, these random jokes that they throw in. At one point, there's basically a spoof of uh, all kinds of things. Like there's a miniature golf sequence that somehow ends up at the Grand Canyon, and it's all kind of illogical in a way. But there's also a randomness to everything that ends up seeming logical with the randomness. I guess I don't know if that makes sense, but anyway, looking back, I'm sure this show feels ahead of its time in a lot of ways with the rapid pacing, the layered humor, the mix of animation styles, the weird aesthetics, and the self awareness. And you can see traces of Kablam and later internet comedy, adult swim bumpers, YouTube sketches, and of course some meme editing styles. I'm sure that this series influenced at least some of those things over the years, and fans still talk about it with genuine affection. One person described it perfectly. The show was so experimental and ahead of its time, and another said that Prometheus and Bob was my life. So, yeah, this show definitely had fans. It ran for more than one season, and nostalgia is a pretty big part of why the show was successful. Kablam, it just doesn't feel that polished or corporate, and it doesn't feel like it's, catering to just itty bitty kids. That's one of the things that a lot of kids, at least that I knew, didn't really like. They didn't like being treated like they're little toddlers all the time. We like the idea of having a little bit of a grown-up energy to our shows that we would watch. We don't want to feel like we're just little babies. And this show is good in that way because it's a little unhinged, but in a way that kids can appreciate and understand. It's like a bunch of artists were allowed to throw every weird idea that they had onto television, and somehow Nickelodeon said yes to it. And honestly, that kind of creative risk feels rare. And if you've never seen all of these types of shows, it's still worth watching today. If you can dig up Kablam, go ahead and check it out. It's not just there for nostalgia either, because I didn't have nostalgia feelings for it exactly because I didn't watch this show as a kid. So I just kind of had to see it with a fresh pair of eyes. But I still enjoyed it, even without that nostalgia experience relating to it. And it was like a snapshot of a moment when children's animation got to be experimental, chaotic, and sort of deeply weird, you know? And somehow, against all odds, it worked, and it lasted multiple seasons, you know? So that's about it. Thanks for listening. I'm surprised by how long I've talked about this episode. Um, it's almost as long as the episode itself. So, yeah, have a good one.